Hey guys, and welcome to Coffeehouse Chess Openings. Today we're going to be discussing one of the most disreputable openings in all of chess, the Fred defense, and also briefly the related Duras Gambit or pseudo-Fred. These openings occur after 1e4, and now a move not to be recommended under any circumstances, f5. After e takes f5, and we'll look at other possibilities a little bit later in the video. Black has the choice of playing the Duras Gambit with knight to f6 or the crazy-looking king to f7, which is the true Fred. And we're going to be concentrating on the true Fred, as it's actually the more interesting of the two branches. What we're going to do, we're going to look at the Duras Gambit really from the standpoint of the white player and how to refute it. Then we'll look at the Fred defense, and we'll first discuss white's ways to gain an advantage of it, and there are many. And then we'll finish up by discussing tips for the black player if anyone is of a low enough moral character to attempt this. Okay, moving on. Before we discuss the Duras Gambit, let's just mention some other possibilities in this position after 1e4, f5. Okay, white can decline the gambit, although the one game that I have where he does this didn't lead to anything for white. White can also play f4, and this transposes into the Swiss Gambit. So if you're a white player and you know anything about the Swiss Gambit, this is a possibility for you. Or you can play d4, which transposes into the Staunton Gambit. So these are good transpositional possibilities to be aware of. But really, it's hard to find a way that black can survive after the acceptance of the pawn. Another possibility I saw recommended online, somebody said, well, bishop e2 just refutes the whole system, and actually it does not. After bishop to e2, f takes e4, d3, knight to f6, we have really an equal position here. As a matter of fact, Rybka slightly prefers black in this position. So this internet advice, like so much advice on the internet, is quite suspect. So let's look at the game where the pawn was refused, and this occurred in a game of with Jack Young, and I believe it was a rated game, a tournament game. He's a brave man, and at this point, let me thank Jack Young for providing me a lot of material for this video. He's actually quite an experienced Fred defense practitioner, and he sent me a bunch of wins and losses. So we'll get into those games a little bit later. But in this game, his opponent was scared, and he played e5. And Jack replied with d5. And Rybka says that black is already equal in this position. So let's just go a little bit further here. White played d4, e6, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to g5, queen to d7, bishop to e2, b6, queen to d2, bishop to b7, knight c3, h6, bishop to e3, castles queenside for black. And let's just take a look at the position. Black's king looks quite safe. White hasn't committed his king just yet. But if he castles kingside, he's looking at a rather massive pawn roller on the kingside there. And black has no problems in this position. He's got good control of e4 and in the center in general, also c4. His black square bishop can get out fairly easily. And the light square bishop is doing a good job of defending the light squares around the king. So this is actually equal according to Rybka. So the game continued, knight to b5, g5, queen to d1, a6, knight to a3, bishop takes a3, b takes a3, knight to a5, and now white should have castled in this position where black would have enjoyed a small edge, but instead the blunder knight to d2 occurred, and after f4, black is winning a piece, and black went on to win this game. And as I said, this was in an action tourney. Okay, so let's go back to our starting position, and now we'll talk about the Duras Gambit. Okay, the Duras Gambit, of the two openings, the Duras and the Fred, I think, well, obviously they're both bad openings, but the Fred is more fun to play, and there's a stronger psychological component. The Duras Gambit may be slightly more respectable, but I don't think white has any problem getting an advantage against it. So, as I said before, this occurs after knight to f6, and Jack Young says that white will play d4 and bishop to d3, and black never gets the pawn back. Black can counter with a later g6 or e6 and rely on the open f file to generate quote play unquote. So let's take a look. Knight to f6, d4, just normal moves. d5 from black, bishop to d3. Now it's going to be very difficult for black to regain this pawn. Well, as Jack says, probably impossible. So a typical line would be knight to c6, knight to f3, just normal moves from white. And if black tries knight to e4, he's not going to be able to maintain it there because, well, actually white has two good lines here. You could try knight to h4 and hold the pawn that way. The knight is actually fairly secure. And there's also a threat here of a queen to h5 check with disaster befalling black. And so that's one approach. You could also try just castling here. And then after bishop takes f5, rook to e1, now e6, knight b to d2. And black can't maintain the knight without losing a pawn, and so he has to retreat. And so black is really falling behind in development here. After bishop takes f5, knight takes f5. We see this position where there's material parity, but black has a lot of problems in this position, and primarily due to his backward e-pawn. White is fully developed. Black king is still in the center, and he's got weaknesses in the light squares around his king, whether he castles or not. And this e5 square is in control of white, and he has this permanent weakness on e6. So even though the material is equal, Rybka considers white to be up almost a full pawn here, and I think that white wouldn't have any problems playing this position. There's no real tricks to avoid, so just sensible play by white gets an advantage against the Duras variation. So we'll go on and talk about the true Fred. So before I get into the fun stuff of playing the Fred from the black position, we'll talk about beating the Fred from the white position. And as you can imagine, there are no shortage of ways to do this. But if you're just looking for a clear way to do it, I'll recommend one here. But first, before we do that, let's take a quick look at a game that was played against Pillsbury. The game began e4, f5, e takes f, and now it's crazy move, king to f7. And Pillsbury elected to play d4 in this position. His opponent played d5, which is not a good move. And Pillsbury sweeps in with queen to h5, g6, f takes g6, king to g7, bishop to d3, knight to f6, bishop to h6 check, king to g8, g takes h7, knight takes h7, queen to g6, bishop to g7, and that was checkmate. Checkmate. Oh, excuse me, the year was 1902. This is Pillsbury Magagna in Paris. Well, let's go back. Black played a particularly weak move there in d5. Let's look at Jack Young's recommendation. He says from this position that white has 3 basic plans, all of which are good. You can attack with queen to h5 check, which is, I would say, is probably not the strongest plan against the Fred. You can ignore the king and play d4, knight to f3. And he can also play what Jack Young considers the main line with bishop to c4. So let's take a look at that. This seems to be the strongest line from Jack Young's perspective. And he's played this opening from both colors. So, okay, so bishop to c4. Now, it looks like a beginner's move because black can simply shoot back with d5. And the bishop loses a tempo. And indeed, black will get the upper hand if white timidly retreats with bishop to b3. But instead, he should play queen to h5. And from this position, if he plays the natural g6, f takes g6, king to g7, queen to d takes d5. And he's threatening checkmate as well as forcing the trade of queens. And this, I think, is the most straightforward path to a white advantage. So let's go back a little bit. What if instead of g6, black plays king to f6? Jack Young jokingly said that if black wants any, quote, winning chances, unquote, he has to play king to f6. And here we go. White will play queen to h4. And now if basically if the black king goes back to f7, white can force an immediate draw. Back and forth. Of course, I'm sure he can do better than the draw, but it's nice to know that if white just wants an early end of the game, he can just do that. If instead black tries to play on, he can play king to f5, and then after bishop to d3 check, king to e6, knight to f3, knight to h6, knight to g5 check. These are all pretty straightforward moves here. King to d6, b3, c5, bishop to b2, knight to c6, queen to f4. Well, in the game that Jack supplied, black played e5, and somehow black went on to win this position, but Rybka considers this winning. And if you just look, black has 2 pieces out. His king is stuck in the middle and very exposed. White is ready to castle. He's got 4 pieces out, and he's ready to develop his last piece, his last minor piece anyway. So there's no way that this is a winning position for black, but it's unlikely that most of your Fred opponents are going to even take this approach. This is only if black plays the very unnatural looking king takes f5. Most are going to go back to f7. And here again, the worst you can do is a draw. Okay, so now we're going to go on to the fun stuff. And that's some tips for playing Fred as black. Okay. Okay, so let's, for a change, let's look at some successes with the Fred. Now, it's hard to believe there are any, but I think that one of the ideas behind the success of this opening, if you can call it success, is the fact that it has a very strong psychological effect on your opponent. you're basically saying, after you play king to f7, you're basically saying, F you, buddy. I think so little of your chess skills that I'm going to play this helpmate type opening, and I'm going to still beat you. And as Jack Young and many others have shown, White often misplays the attack. One of the biggest mistakes I think that White makes is that they think that they're just going to checkmate you right out of the opening. And despite the precarious position of Black's king, it's actually not that easy. It's a tougher nut to crack than you would think. So we're going to look at a couple of different games and a couple of different lines. All wins for Black. One thing that you'll notice is that all these games are really won through White mistakes. I guess that's true of any chess game. But it's the nature of the White mistakes that are kind of interesting. It's usually White playing a very natural move and or overpressing the attack. You'll see examples of that. So let's look at our first game. We'll look at the main line that I just recommended for beating the Fred and seeing how White can misplay this. So that began with bishop to c4 and d5 naturally. Now queen to h5 is the move I recommended for White, and it leads to fairly quick, well, it doesn't lead to a quick end, but it leads to a really bad endgame, super bad endgame for Black. So in the game we're going to follow, this is one of Jack Young's games. White instead played bishop to b3. Now, Jack said knight to f6 should have been played, but he played the riskier bishop takes f5. And now here, the move Jack Young recommends is queen to f3, followed by king to e6. But in this game, White played the natural developing move, knight to c3. And you can see the attraction of this. He wants to win the pawn on d5 and open the path for the bishop to the Black king. But Black has a response, knight to f6. And now, another poor move from White. He should have played knight to d5 here anyway. But instead he played knight to f3. Knight to c6, castles, e6. And amazingly enough, Rybka now considers this position equal. So the lesson here is that if given enough time, Black can actually not only consolidate and find safety for his king, but he can actually reach an equal position. We're only on move 7 here. And after a series of natural moves from White, Black's king is absolutely fine. So d4 was played in the game, bishop to d6, knight to b5, rook to f8, and now White snaps off the bishop. And Jack played c takes d6, but he suggests that queen takes is probably better. I guess he has ideas of trying to play e5 someday. c3, king to g8. Now, if you look at this position, it looks almost like a normal chess game. It's hard to believe that it began the way that it did. His opponent played bishop to g5, queen to e8, queen to e2, bishop to g4, h3, bishop h5, queen to d3. It's really kind of a normal chess game. Knight to e4, exclamation point, bishop to e3. That bishop was attacked. And now he's blocking the defense of the f3 knight. So bishop takes f3, g takes f3, rook takes f3, putting a pin on that bishop, as well as threatening the h3 pawn and massive attack to follow. Bishop to d1. He could have played queen to g6, perfectly good, but this line wins as well. Rook to takes h3, bishop to g4, kind of a last gasp. Queen to g6, pinning the bishop, g3, and now the brilliant move, rook takes f3, forcing rook takes f3, queen to g4 check, king to h2, queen to f3, and white resigned in this position. Okay, now one of the most common reactions that you're going to get to this opening if you play it as black is queen to h5. This is also known as the Mao Zedong attack. Don't ask me why. And we get pretty much the standard position here: g6, f takes g6, king to g7. Okay, now white has a variety of approaches here, but this is a position that is habitually misplayed by white. So let's look at a couple of examples here. In one game, d3 was played with the idea of bringing the dark squared bishop in, bishop h6 sort of ideas. And so let's just follow some of this. H takes g6, queen to e5. This has been seen in many games. Knight to f6, knight to f3, knight to c6. Notice that black has relatively easy development, and although the king may seem exposed, curiously enough, it's the white queen who often ends up being the exposed piece in a lot of these variations. Queen to f4, and now d6. E5 leads to actually an equal position according to Ribchem. In this game we're following, d6 was played, which is still okay. Knight to g5. Guess he wants to, I'm not exactly sure what he wants to do there. e5 was played, queen to g3, knight to d4. And now another natural move from white ends up being a problem. Bishop to e3 was played. And actually black could have won two different ways here. In the game he played knight c2 check, king to d2, knight to a1, knight c3, c6, bishop e2, bishop e7, rook takes a1, bishop to d7, h4. And in the game he played queen to c8, but knight to h5 was probably more incisive, leading to something like this. Bishop takes h5, rook takes h5, blockading the h-pawn. We'll go back to the game. He played queen to c8, d4, knight to g4, bishop takes g4, bishop takes g4, d takes e5, d takes e5, and he should have probably played knight c to e4 here, but he played queen to e5. But after bishop takes f6, queen to f4, rook takes h4, knight c to e4, queen to d7 check, king to c2, bishop to g5, he said was a mistake, queen takes g5, king to d8, queen to d8, queen to e5. Actually, white is winning, but he managed to lose somehow. King to g8, knight to f6 was a mistake, king to f7, bishop to g5, bishop to f5, king to b3, queen to d3 check, queen to c3, queen to b5, king to a3, queen to a4. And this was a game played by, well, I don't want to use his name, but it's one of our own forum members. Let's just refer to him as Condiment Appreciator. He submitted this game. He's actually played a lot of Fred games in his criminal past. So we'll go on and look at a couple other games here. Okay, we'll go back to this position again. This is the standard position from the Mao Zedong attack. Now, you might be interested to know that bishop to d3 is Ribke's choice, and he considers white to be utterly winning in this position. But even with this move, it's still possible for white to go wrong. And here's another game of Jack Young's. Knight to f6, queen to g5, h6, queen to h4, e5, knight to c3, d5. Now, black is getting his pieces out, and white's pawn on g6 actually is an effective shield against the white attack. So black is using that. In the game, he played f3. He's a little worried about e4 as black has got good central control here. Knight to c6, knight g to e2, knight to b4, knight G to g3, knight takes d3 check, c takes d3, bishop to e7, and we've got a little threat against the queen there. Queen to a4, and Jack writes that queen to e8 was probably objectively better, but in the game he played c6, seems natural enough. Castles, h5, and here we have an example of black using the h-file for his own attack rather than being subjected to one himself. And this, if you look at a lot of Fred games online, this is a consistent theme. Black is able to use these open lines for his own purposes. b3 was played in the game. It was a mistake because he needed to do something about h4. Because after knight g to e2, bishop to c5, king to h1, knight to h5, d4, the immediate knight to g3 wins the game. In the game he played e to takes d4 and also won, but let's look at this. Knight g to g3 check, h takes g3, h takes g3, king to g1, and now this nice standard combination, rook to h1, king takes h1, queen to h4, king to g1, checkmate. Again, it's the mistakes that white made were not obvious blunders, but just natural moves that failed to consolidate or press the attack forward. Let's look at a few more games. Now, in this position, which we've seen a couple times before, that's in the Mao Zedong attack, a move often played here is g takes h7. It's not the best, but it's certainly the most natural. After rook takes h7, white has played queen to e5, queen to g5 check. Queen to g5 check is probably the most natural and the one seen the most, but it's actually the weaker of the two. After queen to g5, king to h8. Now this position is mentioned by Schiller. It says black has no compensation for 2 pawns. We'll look at a game. d4 naturally was played. Knight to f6, bishop to d3. And here, bishop to h6 is stronger than what was played. Rook to g7. After bishop to h6, Rybka considers that black has almost enough compensation for 2 pawns. It just gives white an edge, believe it or not. So, but in this game, Jack Young played rook to g7, queen to h6, king to g8, bishop to g5, d5, knight to f3, knight to c6. You can see that it's much harder to attack the black position than one might imagine. Knight b to d2, knight to b4, bishop to g6, c5, c3, knight to c6, castles queenside, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight takes d4, c takes d4, knight to g4, threatening something on f2, queen as well as the queen, queen to h4, of course, queen to h5. He couldn't go to h4 because the bishop would hang on g6, but this allows black to get in. Knight takes f2, rook d to f1, bishop g4, attacking the queen again, queen to h4, queen to c8 check, king to b1, knight takes the rook, bishop to c2, the bishop was also hanging, queen to e6, rook takes h1, bishop to f5, rook to c1, and not bishop takes f5, because that would drop the bishop on g5. After bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop check. So he played rook c8 then, knight to f3, rook takes c2, good move, rook takes c2, queen to e2, exploiting the pin, knight to e1, queen takes d1 check, bishop c1, rook takes g2, You can see the end is in sight. Bishop to c2 check. Knight takes, queen takes, king to a2, queen takes c1, king to b3, king to a4, queen to c4, and that's all she wrote in that game. Okay, so maybe we'll look at one more game here. Okay, so another approach that white can take here is b3, with the obvious idea of bringing the bishop on c1 into the attack. And we have another game of Jack Young. H takes g6, queen to g5, rook to h5. Notice it's the queen that's doing more of the running rather than the black king. Queen to g3, e5, bishop to b2, knight c6. Now black actually has, well, I wouldn't say it's a lead in development, but he's certainly not behind. And he's got this center, and his pieces come out quite easily. Bishop c4 was played, knight f6, and according to Rybka, the position is almost equal. So the lesson to be learned for the white player is that you need to play accurately. Don't assume that because black has played this insane king walk early in the opening that you can just waltz your way to a quick win. Accuracy is required, and because, as I said before, the psychological nature of the opening, a lot of times white is not going to play accurately. They're going to play from an emotional standpoint. It's like, well, I'm going to beat you, you idiot. So in this game, the mistake, again, another natural move from white, ends up costing him the game. So knight to f3 was not recommended. d5, and now black is actually better. He's got good central control, and his two bishops can develop anywhere they want. And the rook is actually doing useful work on the h file, and there's no knockout blow for white on the horizon. Bishop to b5 was played. Knight to e4, knight takes e5, and now knight to g3 would be actually something of a mistake, believe it or not. So we won't look at that variation, but knight to e5 was played, fortunately. Actually, let's just look at the variation very quickly. Knight g3, knight c6, and this is actually, well, it's still a little better for black, but it's not as an incisive continuation as the game. So we'll go back. Jack played knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, king to h7, queen to f4, rook to f5, bishop takes c7, queen to e7 was played, queen to f6 was also possible, queen to e3, bishop to h6, queen to e2, the queen's still running around, rook takes f2, and now white really had to give up his queen here. Queen takes f2, knight takes f2, king takes f2, bishop to g4, bishop to g3, rook to f8, king to g1, bishop to e3. Brilliant move there. If he takes the bishop, then queen to e3 check, bishop to f2, queen takes f2. And in the game, he played bishop to f2, but it works out just the same. Bishop takes f2, and white resigned. Okay, we'll look at one more game and then wrap this up. This last game we'll look at is a game I played. I've only played a couple of games in the Fred, basically as research for this video. And in this game, my opponent played the refutation line, but somehow managed to bungle it anyway. He played bishop to c4, of course d5 is a natural response, and he even played queen to h5. And I played g6 instead of Jack Young's recommended king to f6. g6, f takes g6, we've seen this before, king to g7, and now the refutation line is queen takes d5, forcing a losing ending for black. Instead, my opponent, apparently still enraged by my choice of opening, wanted to continue checking. So he played the Not very helpful. Queen to e5 just allows me to develop a piece. Knight to f6. Bishop to d3. He had to retreat there. Knight to c6, gaining some time on the queen. And gradually, white's advantage is slipping away. Rybka still considers that white is better, has a big advantage, but not as big as it once was. Queen to g3 was played, and now, again, utilizing this idea of having white's pawn do the job of shielding the black king, we move to h5. Knight to f3, and now e5, we're threatening a fork on e4 here. So we played knight to e5, knight to e5. This is a pawn sacrifice to open the e file, which worked out quite well. Queen takes e5, bishop to d6, queen to d4, c5, still gaining time on this queen, so back off to h4. And now the game is really lost for white at this point. Rook to e8 check, king to d1, and then we want to maybe pause and find a good move for black in this position. Okay, the winning move is knight to g4. We're threatening the queen, and the queen can't defend f2 because of the bishop on d6, so really has nothing much better than queen takes queen, but knight to f2 is checkmate. So once again, a series of natural moves by white just allowed black to develop his position, get central control, lots of tempi for developing his pieces. Pieces has easy development, and white went down in flames. Okay, so in conclusion, this is an opening that is not as bad as it looks, although it's pretty bad, but you will find a surprising amount of success in playing this line due to a white overpressing and playing inaccurate moves. It's not a slam dunk as most white players seem to think it is when they play the opening. So if you're inclined to play the Fred, I wish you good luck. And if you meet this as white, then you should know exactly what to do. Hope you enjoyed this. Please leave any comments or criticisms, suggestions in the comments. Thank you very much. Goodbye.